by the Higher Education Sustainability Initiative on transformation of higher education post-COVID-19. My name is Lotta Tähtinen, and I'm the Chief of the Outreach and Partnerships Branch in the Division for Sustainable Development Goals in the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Today's webinar is part of a series that we are organizing on the occasion of the 10-year anniversary of the Higher Education Sustainability Initiative, or HESI for short. Before we start, please allow me to make a few housekeeping announcements. Please note that this event will be recorded. The recording and all relevant information will be made available on the HESI website and shared with all registered participants. Secondly, we would be grateful if all speakers could please keep their cameras on when speaking and keep their microphones muted when they are not speaking. Thirdly, for our audience, we invite you to please use the chat box to ask questions or to share your comments, suggestions. If you do use the chat box, please indicate your name, organization, and country when typing your question. As you all will recall, HESI was established in 2012 in the lead up to the Rio+20 conference as an open partnership between several UN entities and the higher education community to spotlight the critical role that higher education institutions have in driving sustainable development. Today, HESI continues to provide a unique interface between higher education and global policy making around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Dear colleagues, each year, HESI organizes a global forum as a special event in connection with the annual high-level political forum on sustainable development in July, which is the UN's main platform for the follow-up and review of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development at the global level. This year, the HESI Global Forum will take place virtually on 6 July. It will seek to deepen the understanding of the challenges and opportunities that higher education community is facing to support efforts to ensure a sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, which is in line with the overall theme of the high-level political forum this year. Also, at this year's high-level political forum, member states will undertake an in-depth review of a number of sustainable development goals. And these goals are SDG 4 on education, SDG 5 on gender equality, SDG 14 on oceans, SDG 15 on life on land, and finally, the overarching SDG 17 on means of implementation and global partnership. Higher education institutions have a critical role in advancing all of these SDGs through forward-thinking research, innovative partnerships, and by providing an analytical knowledge base for targeted and effective policymaking. Colleagues, the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic to our societies, including the education sector, have been profound and unprecedented. Today's webinar will explore how this pandemic has transformed the approaches by the higher education sector to education and learning, its ability to reach and engage students, including those that lack capacities for rapid digital transformations and online learning. We have a particularly impressive lineup of speakers today to address this topic, and I thank you all for accepting the invitation to be our panelists. I would also like to thank all of our partners and you, our audience, the higher education institution practitioners in particular, for your continued and tireless active engagement in driving current and future generations of creative thinkers to advance sustainable development and the SDGs. With that, I will wish you all an inspiring and productive webinar. And now I would like to hand the floor over to Florencia Libri, who is a senior advisor at Sulitest. Florencia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lotta, and thank you so much for hosting this important webinar. Thank you, Yondesa, Ola, Lotta, as well as Sophie. It's a pleasure for me to support this webinar, as well as HESI, as a co-chair with previously with SCSN and now with Sulitest. So we have a plan, a short exercise to hear a bit from the audience, to understand a bit the composition of this audience today, as well as hear a bit of the feedback of exactly how this journey and this transformation of higher education post-COVID and throughout the pandemic has played out for you. What have been these challenges and opportunities that you have identified, and perhaps even share lessons so we can learn together. So we will do that, and then I'll be very pleased to give the floor to our moderator and that very distinguished panel that we have today. So as you can see in this slide, we have prominently academic institutions representatives joining in, but really a multi-stakeholder here represented from governments to civil society organizations and private sector representatives, local governments, UN entities, and so on. So we're very, very happy to see that these important transformations require multi-stakeholder partnerships, and it's very important that we can have these conversations together. So welcome everyone again, and thank you. And then in terms of the regional distribution, you can see in this other chart how we really have a good representation throughout the world. So Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean as well. So we hope that we will have that flavor throughout this event as well. So in terms of this Menti exercise that we have planned for you today, as I said, and this is the next slide, we will really appreciate if you could, Sophie, I think, include the Menti so you can participate. And this is a thematic feedback from the audience. So if you can log in or just try to basically capture that image with your phone, or go to menti.com and use the code that is stated there, you will be able to participate and provide your feedback. The questions specifically, and I want to do it myself as well, are the first one is on the opportunities. So actually, let me get it. There you go. Which are the following, okay, the first one is the challenges, actually. Following challenges did you experience while teaching and learning during the pandemic? And these are some of the themes that myself, including with other researchers, we have identified through the pandemic. There are some publications coming, but there are many other researchers that have talked generally about these issues, from lack of access and ability to technology and infrastructure, to difficulty of nurture a sense of community and belonging in the communities, and with students and administrators and admin person and so on. Also, oftentimes an increase of the pressure, the Zoom fatigue, mental health in the academic community, to the difficulty in access of educational resources, teaching, learning, or other. And some of you may actually experience multiple of those or all of the above. So we'll see the answers are coming. So wait a couple of minutes for this to populate. Thank you. Interestingly, it's pretty even, but we're seeing already that the difficulty to nurture community and belonging seems to be ahead. which seems quite right. I think throughout the pandemic, we have seen that work remotely and studying and teaching and learning can be done, but to support each other at a more personal, human level. But I think also that poses an important opportunity, right, to learn how we can do that in a remote environment. Great. That's very interesting. So I don't know if there are more responses coming, but it seems like we got there. So pretty even on the others, but I think the nurture sense of community and belonging. And then some of the mental health again, with many people on the technology as well. And then, so resources, I think, is something that there seems to have been more available, yet there has been some difficulties there as well. Wonderful. So this is very interesting. Let's move to the next one, which is on the opportunities that we have found. What are the ways in which were able to leverage some of the change that happened, these transformations? Where are the places that we feel that that actually were able to identify opportunities? Answers are coming. In this case, we have ahead the greater diversity of global experts and educational resources beyond the traditional classroom, which we certainly have seen it with webinars and massive open online courses or other resources that were available. The flexibility in work and education patterns seems to be something that people were able to leverage. And then not so much on the democratization of education, which I think is clearly a lot of place for work there. But then it seems that there has been some increase in the awareness of the SDGs, climate change and other related issues within the community. Good. Some more questions, more answers coming. Well, I hope this was a bit of a snapshot, and I think, you know, the answers are still coming, so maybe we could give it 30 more seconds. And I hope this is a snapshot of how people are feeling right now, how has been the challenges and opportunities. And I look very much forward to hear from the panelists and from the moderators. So I would like to now give the floor to Geraldine Fraser Moleketi. She holds many impressive roles, including as a chancellor for the Nelson Mandela University, as well as the chair of the Committee of Experts on Public Administration, CEPA, which is an expert body of the ECOSOC. With this, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy and learn from this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florencia, and thank you as well, you know, to HESI for arranging this particular session, and Lotta for the introduction. This afternoon, and this morning to you in New York and parts of Latin, South, Central America and beyond, we see this as an exciting opportunity to have a discussion on what's a very important area and issue for higher education as a whole. We've had an indication of the intention of the Transformation Education Summit that will take place in September this year. And of course, the intention there is to mobilize political ambition, action, solutions, and solidarity to transform education. But at the end of the day, in higher education, we have on the panel people who are at the coal face of ensuring transformation. We'd like to acknowledge, and just taking a lead from what has come through the interactive session right now, we'd want to acknowledge that the pandemic has pushed boundaries in the area of education and higher education, including those of higher education in respect of exposing vulnerabilities of higher education systems, while opening space for discussions like the one that we're having today on taking advantage of how of new possibilities for the higher education praxis. Because we have a limited time, I am not going to talk much more. I'd also encourage you to have a look at the CVs of our panelists who bring rich experience from across the sector. And please don't hesitate to put your questions on the chat as well, because I will draw on this as we engage with the session. I've noted that we've got an audience that's quite widespread from across the African continent, from Europe, from Asia, from North America, and South and Central America, as I indicated earlier. So I'm going to immediately at this point pose a question to Miss Wina Gere, and I'm not going to introduce her any more than say that she's from the University of the Philippines, and Wina in the next 5 minutes is going to give us her experience on what the main ways are in which the higher education landscape and teaching and learning has changed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. She will also go into what the opportunities and challenges are that she observed during this period. So over to you, Wina. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again to HESI for this opportunity to share our experience in the Philippines. So just maybe I'll focus on the first question first, and then maybe allow for the discussion and dialogue later about how, the higher education landscape and teaching and learning have actually changed. So emerging through the pandemic, we are definitely seeing a very different landscape in our country's higher education system, having grappled through implementing the much needed institutional changes and reforms. But I think it's important to say that the pandemic essentially catalyzed and hastened simply these changes and innovations that were rather long overdue. And so what happened in the last 2 years with higher education in my country was the rapid transition from traditional to more what we call agile and adaptive modes of teaching and learning, which are not necessarily new. So we initially grappled as, of course, with the pandemic, we were not prepared for that. So we were compelled to go full remote and online to ensure there's continuity of learning amidst the threats. And of course, we were compelled to finally fully utilize and maximize our existing digital learning management systems, which many of our faculty members have been refusing to use despite its availability because, it's like highly sophisticated, complicated learning management systems. So only very few at least are using them. But the pandemic has forced us out of our comfort zones and pushed us to recognize the hard questions and realities. So it compelled us to face and act on a rather underdeveloped innovation ecosystem and address prevailing issues of inequitable access and uneven quality of education in our country. And of course, act on the required paradigm shift and the imperatives of globalization-related changes, enforce these national and regional qualifications frameworks with learning outcomes as metrics, ensure the quality assurance of education toward outcome-based, learner-focused education anchored on lifelong learning that is flexible, open, and accessible. So in the past 2 years, there was a lot of rethinking about how we teach and learn to be truly inclusive and responsive to the evolving requirements and changing rhythms of this so-called highly disruptive world. So it is, of course, right now, it's not fully established yet. It is an ongoing transition and a continuous process and deliberations, of assessments and iterations. But we are indeed fast moving forward toward institutionalizing the so-called hybrid learning environments. And this involves an ongoing redesign of our curriculum in terms of structure, and delivery and assessment. So in terms of structure, like these involves, of course, the convergence of disciplines, how we are partnering with industry and civil society. In terms of delivery, we are rethinking about a more immersive experiential learning, these 21st century models of problem-based learning and competence-based learning, design thinking, and even other futuristic learning spaces, as well as our assessment, whether it's performance-based, it's authentic, it's real-time. So we are moving toward, adopting new strategies, such as mixed mode education, like including flipped classrooms, for example, with blended learning pedagogies and disruption tolerant micro learning or micro credentials, such as redesigning our courses into MOOCs or these massive open online courses, which are, of course, available already in other universities, mostly from developed countries. And so right now, I would end by saying, at least this part, that we continue to take stock about what works, and tailor the most effective combinations of approaches, or the so-called blends of learning, to make them really effective and truly accessible, now taking into consideration the differentiated and specific needs, requirements, and resources of our learners. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Weena. Now, it appears that I have a problem with my camera, and I can see myself on the screen, but it seems no one else can. But we'll try and figure that out as we go along. And in the interest of time, I'm going to continue. I picked a few words out of what you raised. The fact that the pandemic pushed us out of our comfort zone. You made a reference to underdeveloped ecosystems. You talked about quality of education. So at this point, I'm going to turn to Ms. Romila Moe, who's the Commissioner of Higher Education, to also come in and speak to us, particularly on the main ways in which the higher education landscape and teaching and learning has changed as a result of COVID-19. Has the experience been any different, or is there more to add? Because I think what we'd want to do is to add and build on what's come from the other speakers. Thank you. Are you there, Romila Moye?
Okay, yes, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, thank you very much. And so I am Professor Romila Moye. I am the Higher Education Commissioner from the island of Mauritius. So right now it's almost 6 p.m. And being the head of the regulatory body, I'm going to talk and add a little bit to what Weena said. I'm going to talk from three perspectives: the teaching, learning, and also from the regulatory body perspective. I have also to say that prior to being the commissioner, I've been the vice chancellor of the National University in Mauritius. And so I'm quite familiar with what my colleagues have been doing during the lockdowns. So basically during, we have had 2 lockdowns of around 2 months where we closed everything. So obviously in March 2020, as Weena said, same thing in our place in Mauritius. We have 10 public universities and 40 private higher education providers, and they all had to stop face-to-face classes. No one was allowed to go to campus. And so most of them resorted to emergency remote teaching. And this is quite funny because people are saying it was blended learning, online learning, using OERs, but I would say that it was emergency remote teaching, like recording lectures, like contacting students through WhatsApp, putting PDFs on the screen, and then, you know. However, having said that, in March 2021, we had another lockdown, and this time, around half of the institutions went to really online classes. So they had learned. They had invested into like open source online management systems like Moodle, etc. So I can say safely that around 50% of the institutions were having online classes. And during the 2 lockdowns, we have had major issues with assessment, with field work, practical work, lab work. All these had to be shifted. Assessment had moved to portfolio-based assessment. Graduations could not take place. So again, this didn't give like a very feel-good factor. We had to kind of continue motivating students not to drop out and to stay in campuses. And one very important thing which we noticed with private higher education providers is that most of the international students who have had to go back to their countries could not come back. So they couldn't come back on time. So private universities had to revisit their university models, business models very quickly. They had to adapt because they were used to be having like a regular supply of international students, paying students. So this was something which really disrupted in Mauritius. We managed to give some facilities for them to access digital libraries. So in terms of access to information, I think this went very well. And one important thing was that in our country, we ask students to be vaccinated twice before coming back to campus. So even if they could come back after the lockdowns to resume classes or to take exams or to do field work, many of them had difficulties because they had to be vaccinated. So this was mainly a bit like what Weena said, we moved to online, blended learning, etc. They are still adapting, although I would tend to say that when things get better, they do tend to go back to their previous ways. In terms of student experience, so we did a survey. We had around 7,000 students who responded to our survey. We wanted to know what has been their learning experience during these lockdowns. And most of them said that they had no problems to interact with the trainers, with the tutors, with the staff, through WhatsApp, through all sorts of social media, and that they were all given their course assignments and their course materials, so they didn't like complain about that. Most of them complain about the new assessment structure because year 1, year 2, year 3 of some programs had to go to portfolio, project-based, more written assignment rather than coming and having a 3-hour exams. And also they said that the tutors didn't give enough time in terms of written work. As a regulatory body, as the regulatory body of the country, so I have to talk a little bit on regulatory framework. So our regulatory framework could not be applied during these 2 years, I would say. We could not conduct accreditation visits to renew accreditation and to even conduct quality assurance audits. So we have had to be very flexible and adapt to some kind of new situation and rapidly change regulations. This proved to be a big challenge for us because we still have like a huge, heavy system of establishing regulations, of giving accreditation, licenses to private bodies, etc., etc. I think I'll stop here for now. And is question 3 being taken now, or is it going to be later?
Discussion will take place after the presentations. And
Okay.
thanks for that quite illuminating presentation
Thank you.
that brought the issue of emergency remote teaching into the room for us today, as well as the challenges confronting higher education institutions as it relates to international students, the issue of the regulatory environment, how you need to deal with that in adapting to a new situation, course assignments, complaints by students, and so the list can go on. And I, at this particular point, against this background, want to move to Mr. Paul LeBlanc, the president of the Southern New Hampshire University, who has shown even prior to the pandemic, shown us a movement of, having 10,000 students to more than 100,000. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. It's a pleasure to join you all. So the update on those numbers is that we're now 180,000 students. And the point I want to make about that is that 40,000 students joined us in the first year of the pandemic. So we saw a migration of students who were looking for online and flexible ways of learning that could, I think, also support lives that were deeply disrupted. So I think I would make a point about who we typically serve at my university, which are students. I often say the students who would struggle to come up with $400 for an unexpected car repair. In our economy, a fairly small amount. My point in that is that they're fragile. They don't have a lot of social capital. They're often learners who are hanging on by a thread. So it doesn't take much to disrupt their learning and to knock them out of higher education system. And that's probably, everything that Weena and Ramila said echoes with me. We saw lots of emergency remote learning going on. We saw a lot of flexibility. We learned that students in traditional campuses actually adapted pretty well to a lot of their remote and online learning, but that they deeply missed the opportunity to be on those campuses with their peers in the community. So I'd like to shift our conversation just a little bit to what I might say are sort of more human-centric questions as opposed to learning and delivery questions. So one of the things that we've seen in the United States is historic levels of mental health challenge, anxiety, depression, suicide ideation. 1 in 5 adolescents report suicide ideation in the last 12 months. This took a tremendous toll. Its deepest toll, to my second point, is around the inequities, and I think Weena sort of mentioned this in passing. We saw a spotlight shown on the inequities within our system. And when we look at where we are today, 2 years into the pandemic, we've lost 1 million students from the higher education system that just dropped out, disappeared. What we know about that are a couple of things. So one is that mental health impacts were huge. It was disproportionately, of that number, we see a disproportionate number of low-income students and students of color. So those who have always been historically least well served by the U.S. higher education system were even less well served in the context of a pandemic. If you think about who, their families didn't have the choice of working remotely. They're working in stores, they're working in supply chain, they're working in factories. So they had to go to someplace every day, and they were often overburdened. So the number of hours required of them increased, even as their learning became more challenging. I think that as we look for, what does all of this mean today? In the United States, we are in this we're still trying to understand what's going on with our workforce, but generally speaking, it's been called the Great Resignation. Some have called it an informal national strike, but we see millions of people refusing to go back to bad jobs. They're not going to go back to low-paying positions in retail or in the travel industry where they don't have clarity around their schedules and they're not paid very well. At the very same time, we see a lot of those jobs paying more than they ever did before. So part of what's happening right now is that low-income learners are making choices quite often between, do I go to college or do I take a job at an Amazon warehouse that's paying $25 an hour, a number that was unthinkable and feels like a lot of money to them in the moment, because if you look at their background, it is a lot of money to them in the moment. So general big shift that's going on overview for us in the US would be a loss of students, a demographic cliff that's coming in 2025. We are an aging nation. We will see fewer students coming out of high school. A workforce that's willing now to pay more than it ever did before. And I think for a lot of students, a new demand for shorter term learning, what we might call micro-credentials or certifications. They need those to be more affordable. They need them to be quicker because they're stuck. They may not want to go back to that bad job, but they need the skills to go to a good job. So they want those certificates to be laser focused on skills and tied to high demand jobs. That's kind of where the play is right now. So we see a marching towards STEM, tech generally, and healthcare to some extent. So it's an interesting time. We often sort of say, observe, the world has obviously changed in the last 2 years. Our student behaviors have changed in the last 2 years, how they expect to engage, what they need from us, what they're looking for from a higher ed ecosystem. And then, of course, our own employees' behaviors have changed. So the last thing we haven't really touched on this is that we have thousands of employees. We're a very large university. 64% of them have chosen not to come back to the workplace. We've given them an option to remain remote. And interestingly, across the United States higher ed landscape, in our traditional campuses, our traditional residential campuses, and Susan perhaps is better positioned to talk about this in a moment, our faculty are the least willing to come back. They are the most conservative in terms of their COVID concerns, anxieties. So they're kind of insistent, and in places where we have strong unions, it's been very difficult for campuses to resume natural operations. So to conclude, I would say the following things as we look forward. Geraldine, I think we recognize, we talk a lot about curriculum. I mean, we're academics. We can talk about curriculum all day long. We can talk about systems and LMSs and delivery, but what the pandemic reminded us is that learning is so fundamentally human-centric, and that the sort of, a holistic understanding of our students' needs, their mental health, their well-being, their emotional state, I think has to inform the next generation of learning as we think about what the future requires of us, particularly for underserved populations. I think we know that learning now needs to be a whole lot more flexible. Degrees will still be really important, but so will micro-credentials. I think we're also seeing in the US a rising up of new providers. And those are things like coding boot camps, of course, shorter term credentials, but there are also programs like Grow with Google, which now operates with 200 large employers who say those micro credentials will be valued by them when they do their hiring. And then I think we'll see a new focus on rethinking our financial aid systems to support those shorter term learning programs, et cetera. So that's the broad picture as I look at it in the US today. And I would say one last thing, if I may. Can I add one code to that, Geraldine? It's interesting. I think our culture feels in the US, if you've been watching these, pretty frayed. So we're very politicized. I think it's a lot split. I think our faculty and our staff are tired. It's been a tough 2 years. And one of the things I'd observe is I see my colleagues retiring in huge numbers. So university leaders who hung on for the first year or two of the pandemic because it felt like a terrible time to leave are now saying, okay, I stayed on, I did my duty, I'm leaving. And then a lot of people's like, I'm done. This is just too exhausting. And it's been an interesting thing to watch. And I don't know how we revitalize our ranks. Like, all of our people need our warm embrace, and they need to get their footing back under them, I think, as we go into the next year.
Thank you very much, David. I'm sorry, Paul. Thanks for that. I'm going to go directly into Susan, who will also be dealing with question 3, with the one of what are the lessons that you can share with the audience, because we've got some really significant learnings from Paul. And I also see the questions are coming in, so I'd like to come back. So let me just hand over directly to you, Susan, because I think there'll be an interplay between what was raised earlier and yourself. Over to you.
Thank you, Geraldine. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. And yes, I think our experiences here complement what I've heard all my colleagues say to date. And I really want to underscore Paul's comment that we've got to pay attention to our faculty and our staff as well as our students. Our faculty have been stepping in and trying to support students with mental health crises and all of that. Let me frame my remarks with two overarching themes and then give you a brief context for my observations. One is we have shown that in higher ed, we can move more nimbly and more quickly than we ever imagined. And I think it's an incredible opportunity, and we're exhausted, but we can't miss this moment in time to really reimagine and advance learning experiences, because the world has changed so quickly and the students are out there, our learners are out there of all ages, counting on us to create a bright future for them. And then in all of this, what I'm hearing that resonates so closely with the SDGs is no one should be left behind. And that has been pulled into sharp focus over the last couple years. So I speak from the perspective of someone that manages the academic pursuit at a residential campus with a fairly significant school for continuing education, adults that never completed their degrees. So yes to everything Paul's seen, both with that demographic and with the students that were so anxious to get back to campus after a great rapid transition. I happened to be in the classroom when we shifted over the spring break, and it was emergency teaching, but people that thought they would never, I mean, online was evil, right? They see things differently, and there's a moment to build on the best of that. Simultaneously, I was co-chairing the program for Learning at Scale, which is an international group that looks at online learning at large scale and how you infuse the research on learning. I also chair the U.S. National Academy of Sciences Board on Science Education. I'm a biologist and a STEM education researcher. And what I saw there was fascinating, and perhaps some aspects of this haven't been mentioned yet that might enrich our conversation. First, it was actually the summer of 2020. Learning at Scale continues. I'm really excited about where we're going. But that first summer, we created a special opportunity for people that had made this shift to come together in a session. And learning globally from each other was powerful. And I'll give you just one example. Computer science teachers from across the globe had come together and found ways to share their teaching and their teaching materials, and in their own classrooms use these collaborative tools. That is unlikely to have happened as rapidly. And how we as a global community can together enhance the success of our students is one more opportunity I hope we don't miss. And then what I'd like to add to the conversation, and it ties to Paul's comments about attending to the overall holistic well-being of our students, is we have a robust evidence base, not just on how to improve the cognitive learning of our students, but how to attend to the socio-emotional domain of learning. And we can and ought pull on this robust body of literature. And I think this can help with both No One Left Behind, with attending to mental health issues, with what does inclusion really look like. So we know many things that work to create a true sense of belonging for our students. We know about low-cost, wide-scale interventions that can be done digitally as well as in person. We know quite a bit about how to support resilience, and oh my goodness, right? We all need to figure out how we get past this incredible resilience fatigue we're all experiencing right now. And I think more than anything, what has been underscored, and there's many, many dimensions to this, but I just wanted to pick three, is relevance. Our students need to understand that what they're doing is relevant. They're working so hard, they're pulled in many directions. Why is this valuable? So courses that popped up on understanding COVID or understanding more about COVID policy began to illustrate the value of higher ed. And at least in the United States right now, I'll close by saying we need to step back and really be clear about the value proposition of higher education, rethink the models in the way, again, Paul, I have such admiration for the way you rethought higher education, both when we were working for the US federal government and with what you've done at Southern New Hampshire. We need to be agile, we need to be innovative, and we have the research behind us to do it, and we have the case studies, and we need to be bold, and we need to be brave, and we can do this. And I think it's an incredibly exciting moment in time, and to do it globally is even more promising. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much for that high note, Susan, as you remind us that what we're dealing with is ensuring that we leave no one behind, but we're deeply cognizant of the fact that we have lost 1 million students in higher education, as pointed out by Paul. And as indicated by those joining us in the web, in the chat box, the challenges are different from country to country. And we need to take context into account, but there are certain similarities. So, Mr. Estrada, Mourinho, Alfredo of the University of Lima, you'll be the last speaker before I bring the audience into the room through the questions on the chat box, and I'll encourage those who want to ask questions. This is your opportunity for the next at least 50 minutes. We'll have quite a robust engagement. And Estrada, we want you to look at what are the challenges and opportunities that you've observed from where you are seated. And secondly, what lessons can you share with the audience? How would you like them to shape the future of higher education? And I mean, we're all about using the opportunity out of what the devastation that's been there. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. And I'm very glad to share in this space with all of you. And the pandemic revealed the fragility of all the planet. It put our quick responsibilities into test, and like you say, throw us a big lessons in different sectors, especially in the higher education. And the main challenge became in main lessons. For our experience here in Peru, the students and teacher interactions was the main challenge. For different reasons, the biosecurity reasons, the virtual higher education is a generalized practice. This experience has taught an essential lesson to us. The future of higher education will depend on how the digital literacy is adopted in an effective and efficient way, and it must be focused in three important elements on the virtual and hybrid academic ecosystem: processes, learning environments, and education agents. For it to be successful, it has to be dynamic, cooperative, and the most important, ethical. And one of the second topic is the academic strategies. The organizational, the curricular, and the didactic aspects it has to impact in the human factor, in the student and the teacher. Let me explain about the teacher. The main challenge is the role of the teacher. The teacher is a manager of a new way to facilitating, building, and rebuilding knowledge with the students, but it uses the soft skills acquired for the management of blended learning environments, as well as teaching. The collaboration and empathy in the learning environment is the key of the transition stage in the hybrid university education. The empowerment of the students, the emotional stabilities, and the confidence of both teachers and students. If we don't have the human factor properly addressed, the teaching learning ecosystem in hybrid format will not be successful. In this way, in the University of Lima, let me share the experience. We have an institutional program called Plan Ética Ulima. In Plan Ética Ulima, students have their first level of studies, a theory course of civic ethics. Here, they identify a problem which is developed and solved in the following levels of studies within the framework of the SDGs. For this, they count of the health of studies within the framework of the objectives of SDGs. They count on the help of teachers and other members of the university community, and they start to work about the problem, the sustainability development problem. The last year, in the lockdown time, 70 students participate in SDG projects. Right now, in the hybrid time, we are talking about around 150 students with 150 SDG projects is working on right now, according topics such as inclusion, care of the planet, respect for diversity, fear of hunger, and others. We all know the higher education is defined by its results based on practical ethics, led by an autonomous and self-regulated students, but in a modern way, and aware that the present and the future require their participation for the SDGs and for the planet. This is another new opportunity offered by the hybrid format, teaching and learning in different spaces where consistency and ethics must be applied by all the actors involved. I think it has changed to create better opportunities for the student empowerment. If the university has an educational model based in a citizenship and professional competencies for social and environmental responsibility, the students' interest is how to help their community and how to make an impact through their professional training. We're always, this will be the same. Nowadays, the collective interest is a particular driver right now in the students. Today, the students want to be an active agent of change, but not only to develop passive knowledge, because in these post-pandemic times, we all know the theory of development has moved to the action of development. Thank you very much, Geraldine, for this time.
Thank you very much. And in many ways, I think a comment by Richelle Wimmer says, which responds in a way to or resonates with what you raise, where she said, I think students need to experience relevance more than understand relevance. I'm going to go back to the panelists, and I'm going to present to you some of the exciting comments and questions raised. I want you to link it back to the 4 questions that we have. And I'll start with a question, as I said, from a question from Ratna. And I'm going to ask all of you, because I'm going to reverse the order this time in responses. So Ratna says, how do you define hope for your students during this difficult period? And I want to just get a quick pass through, 1 minute from each of you, so that we can go to the next questions. And if I can start with you, Alfredo, how do you define hope for your students during this time?
Hope is today. Hope is the evaluation that right now the lecturers is taking to the students. Is the impact that produce the evaluations. For me, hope is a few actions that the students can make. Not a big action, no plenty of resources that the students could need to make the action. Hope is the different ways that the students can avoid anybody stay behind, like Professor.
So hope,
professor
hope is ensuring that faculty and students, amongst them, no one is left behind, as far as I can see.
For sure.
So I am not going to ask Susan, I'm not going to ask you that question only. I'm going to go to some of the comments that have come from Sahar Atia from Cairo University, where she spoke about, and I mentioned it earlier, that challenges are different from country to country. You know, it's the whole issue, especially in developing countries where the digital divide is clear. It also depends on the nature of courses, when the instructor needs labs or studios or site visits. And here we have to admit that new innovative tools have to be used in teaching. So shifting from online learning to shifting to e-learning and online learning requires a modification in the curriculum platform and tools to ensure successful learning. You started talking about it. Can you elaborate on that? Can you respond to some of these issues raised? Over to you.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we look at specific contexts and we don't try to transfer approaches from one context to another without really understanding what's needed. I taught a course on sustainable development in the fall, and one of my students was very interested in how you provide professional development to teachers, and she happened to be looking at secondary school math teachers, and she was very interested in sub-Saharan Africa, and she discovered that there were these very low-cost units that could be used to develop professional development of teachers that were already teaching there, not to have outside experts come in, but to empower the folks that were already doing the work there and understood the cultural context to work with teachers on their own professional development, I think we need to really respect and learn from each other. The relevance question, I think hope and relevance come from getting out in your own community, applying the learning you have, but not going out and providing something to someone, but co-creating with them and meeting a need together. And that does not have to be digital, right? I think we have to be really creative about our specific context. And I do think we find ways to share what we know about how to help each other, but in a true engaged partnership where we co-create and we link the practice and the research together. So I think we all need to get out in the world more. And I know the international programs we sponsor here at Rollins, we spend a huge amount of time preparing our students to go out in a way that they listen, they learn, they engage, they co-create together. They're not tourists or dictators.
Thanks, Susan. So you also spoke earlier about faculty across the globe and the use of a collaborative tool. And hopefully that doesn't end now that we're coming out of the worst of COVID. And I want to leave that because I'd want a few other members to pick up on that, because there's also the issue of competition between public and private universities. And how do we overcome that in as difficult a moment as now? And for that, I'm going to jump some of the others. And Romila, I know I've mispronounced your name earlier, but I'd like you to come in, because as commissioner and being in Mauritius, you've also been exposed to some of these realities. Can I get you to just speak a bit to the questions that have been raised? Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm now going to talk a little bit about all my friends and colleagues in Africa, because when the pandemic started, I did a survey within 16 SADC countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And I wanted to share with the audience that it is very true that there are specificities based on which region you are in. And when we are talking about hope and we are talking about SDG and no one is left behind, I think that one of the things that really strikes us is that the pandemic has indeed created inequalities, and inequities like what Paul said. How do you talk about, how do you think that these people who do not have access to electricity, who do not have digital devices, who had to share a computer with 5 other members in the household, how would they not be left behind? And I know that in Mauritius, I'm going to take the example of the Open University. What they had to do was to rapidly find iPads to give to their students so that these students could continue their learning. But that would be, again, a country importing iPads. How suddenly they have 12,000 students? So, I mean, these are realities. It is, how would I say, it is very interesting to say, yes, we must make sure that no one is left behind. Yes, we are doing all these efforts. But the reality on the ground is not at all like that. And my findings, I mean, I can send that to Ola. There was a report which came from that baseline survey over 16 SADC countries. Most of them didn't have access to the devices. Some of them had access to the devices, but didn't have the policies, or their lecturers were not really trained into the pedagogy, because when we're talking about online and e-learning, it's not only the technology. I would say the pedagogy is more than important, especially when you can't reach the students. I mean, I have a lot to say on that, but what I wanted to say 2 more things. One is that
in your last minute, last 60.
Okay, the hope is that I believe that students who have been able to survive this kind of e-learning, they have become more, how would I say, creative, more learning by themselves rather than being spoon-fed, which was happening a lot in our countries. And also they were sharing more. So this concept of global citizen, I think they felt that this is a global problem. It's no longer me just going to class and trying to survive. So this is my point. And the last point is that we are talking about higher education. Please, 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 let's not forget about research, which has suffered a lot and which informs the teaching of higher education. So for many people in STEM, like Susan said, I mean, I'm an engineer, and most of my colleagues could not continue their research during the pandemic for various reasons. But that's another topic that we can take later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wina, I'm holding you for last, and I'll come back to Paul at this point. And Paul, I want you to pick up on some of the questions that have come up earlier, but I also want you to deal with a question that has come from Mary Ombelwea, who says, we certainly left behind here in Nigeria in spite of goal SDG 4 on access to education. We will work on it though. Thanks for the opportunity. So that's sort of just a comment. But Romanoxi Isabel Beatrice says students aren't prepared mostly in pedagogical methods in higher education. Especially they are content expert. She says they ill prepared to look at it, and I think it's an issue that has already been Rumila has touched on, and maybe I should throw in the last point from Joe JB Bazirake from South Africa, who said, what are your views on the Times Higher Education Impact rankings based on the SDGs that incidentally took off around the same time as the pandemic? Are these likely to reveal more helpful indications of impact than previous systems of higher education ranking, which have limited the strive for university recognition to aspects that would neither be considered student-centric nor community-centric? Over to you.
Well, there's a lot in there. And I was struck with just watching as you were speaking, Ramila's comments struck a nerve with lots of people who are clearly struggling with underserved learners who don't even have the most basic infrastructure. I would say that I'd like to sort of start with this question of impact and hope. These are all sort of outcomes, right? These are like what we want to produce in our world, in our work. And I think we so often measure those things on our terms. And I might suggest that a genuine move to student centricity requires us not only to make students feel like they matter to us, but it's mattering that communicates we understand who they are. So when I think about leadership, I often think all of us who are on this call are in the positions of being storytellers. I sometimes say a president or a chancellor is a storyteller in chief, right? They tell the story. But I've come late in my career now, as my gray hair attests, to thinking of my job as being a collector of stories. And the wonderful Nigerian novelist Adichie writes about the danger of a single story. We need to understand our students in the complexity of their stories, whether we're working right now with the Ministry of Education in Ukraine to talk about how we can use online learning to serve students who have been displaced by the war, whether it's someone who is, lining up for hours to get water for their family and dealing with periodic, lack of electricity. How do we think about understanding those stories so that we customize our solutions for them? So I don't really understand. I don't pay attention to rankings, to be honest with you. I think they're works of fiction and they skew our work. So forgive me for not being very helpful on that last category. But, we are doing work with refugee learners in Malawi and in Kenya and Rwanda and Lebanon and other places. And I've been struck in that work, and these are perhaps the most underserved learners in the world, that our job is to understand their stories, give back to them their dignity and their hope on their terms, And then to sort of, we are focusing more on infrastructure and working with refugee-led organizations to empower our learners to own their learning. And this is the fundamental shift that I want to come all the way back to from the beginning, which is that I have a slightly anarchist hope for higher ed, which is that we lose our monopoly hold on what counts for learning. Because I think we are a mixed bag at best. And it's been exciting. We raised money, we built a school in the Zuleika refugee camp in Malawi, which by some counts is one of the poorest countries in the world. And watching the refugee learners organize their learning with our help. So this is a kind of co-op model where we bring them expertise, we bring them help with technology, et cetera. But it's an amazing and very different kind of learning experience to observe firsthand. It's an experiment still not completed. But I think we have to more fundamentally think about our role as enablers of learning on student terms rather than our being the arbiters of learning for the ways that matter most to us.
So now I come back to you, Wina, and you've listened to this rich discussion. You've heard the questions that have come up. You've heard the inputs from colleagues. What are your views? And I want to, and I'm throwing this in, but it should have also gone out to everyone, where Richelle Wimmer had said, what do you think about creating preparatory programs in higher education for tech studies as well? So I'm putting the whole bag together, whether it's from Sabar in Egypt to anywhere else in the world, yeah?
Let me try. Well, yeah, it's really, you know, it's a big discussion, right? What we have right now. The current situation in the Philippines is there's a wide discrepancy between the enrollment in senior high school to the college. And that is exactly what we are trying to address. How do we narrow that gap? How do we address that? And we are recognizing that as much as there's a lot of challenges that are being brought forth by the pandemic, and because of this shift that we need to do, there are in fact a lot of opportunities that have been opened up. And this is, I think, highlighted by President Paul with regards to, you know, really institutionalizing these micro-credentials, thinking about frameworks of making education more accessible, more affordable for the students. And I think that is where the hope is coming from, going back to the other question. It's really about, you know, showing to the students that the kind of education that they are getting is something that they can, you know, apply to their lives. It's after all about lifelong learning. It's about problem solving. It's about responding to the most critical issues, you know, of our very disruptive world. So I think that is the biggest challenge. And to the question on paying attention, you know, like as we shift with our pedagogies, do we continue to pay attention to these, you know, rankings, university rankings? And we tend to be obsessed about that because often, you know, when we, you know, the challenge of these cross-border competitive academia is also to be associated with the institution and the rank of our institution. But the beauty about the THE responding to the SDGs is that we remind ourselves that the sustainability framework is a holistic framework. And even if they say that, oh, you've got to respond to SDG number 4, SDG 5, I think it's important for us educators not to pay so much attention to the indicators, rather, you know, like remind ourselves that the very point of this is to really look into the outcomes, the learning outcomes, the quality assurance, which I think is the point of these metrics. It's really forcing us to not, you know, we don't like to cherry pick, but it's really about forcing us to identify how are we actually responding with our programs, if only to force us to rethink that way, you know. So this is really, and I think I might have to really end, I know we're running out of time. The disruptive future is here, and this is our new normal. And this is the kind of a new normal that is highly volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's completely ambiguous. And so there's a lot of uncertainty that we have to manage. there's so much inequity that we have to address. I think what I could say, listening to all the panelists, there is definitely no one size fits all in all of this. I think the real challenge for all of us is, to continue adopting the models and continue to take stock and reassessing about what works and what is the best combination, maximizing these opportunities, and really just push for this continued learning for our students. So yeah, there's so much to take advantage from the opportunities that are being opened up from this pandemic. And again, before I'm almost forgetting, I think it's very important that as we continue, we also have to be able to be granular. And to be able to be granular is to be, again, context specific, paying attention to the differentiated needs, the requirements, and the resources of our learners, but also emphasizing that much as we want to be learner focused, we are also dealing with our faculty and our staff that are humans too, so we also don't ignore them in that regard. And to end this from my end is that
thank you
we
very
really
much,
have,
Weena.
yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. I had hoped that I'd be able to go around the room and get everyone to have opportunity to say a word, but we won't be able to have a final word because we really tight for time, and I hope you'll excuse me. What's very clear to the HESI organizers that this has been really a successful webinar that you've brought together in terms of the substance of it. And I want to just pull out a few of the points that have come up here today that I think is quite striking. And the one issue that I'd want to re-emphasize is that the pandemic has pushed us out of our comfort zones. We've got to use this opportunity, and we've actually got to be audacious in how we respond to it. That our response needs to take into account the context, and contexts differ, and they differ within countries and between countries, between regions as well. So I'm sure that as we listen to Paul and Susan, they will talk about the inequalities in the United States of America. They will talk about the challenges around diversity and where certain communities have been left behind. And that's the particular reality that's there. There's also the context between regions. And we need to see how we overcome that divide, because we've also seen over the past 2 years that there's been a huge chasm that has opened up. And this was raised very clearly around the issue that came up around access to equipment, access to bandwidth, access to facilities. But I think the question, as we deal with these inequities, what we shouldn't overlook is the question you've raised, the issue you've raised around mental health. And this has been both for students and faculty, and that we need to take this into account. And I just note a quote that says that the sustainability framework is a holistic framework, and there must be quality outcomes, and that it forces us to rethink the disruptive future that's here. And this is part of what we're doing. The issues around impact and hope being an outcome. And I think on that, I have hit 16:20 South African time on the nose, and I've not done justice to all the issues, but in order to do justice to our audience and the meeting itself, I now want to hand over to Ms. Wan John Yoon, the program specialist of UNESCO, who will be giving us an update on the processes related to the Transforming Education Summit. And allow me to thank our audience and the panelists. And I think we need to talk more. The discussion has just begun. So over to you, Juan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. My name is Juan Jung Bian. Please call me Juan, and I'm based in Paris at UNESCO headquarters. So I've been invited to share a short update on where this Transforming Education Summit preparation is going, and also to invite you for your interest and collaboration on this process. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So as many of you would already know, this Transforming Education Summit is part of the Our Common Agenda of the UN Secretary General that was announced last year, and one of the 12 commitments that he has made under that agenda. And this summit is being planned for September 2022, so this year in New York. And the objective of this summit is to mobilize political will and commitment to education as public good. This is also very much in line with the Futures of Education report that UNESCO has published last year. And the conversation definitely will engage diverse stakeholders across the world. Next slide, please. So there are 3 work streams around this summit. First is on the national consultations, bringing together different stakeholders at national level, led by usually by the ministries of education. Secondly, it's thematic action tracks, which I will delve into further in the next slides. And finally, the third work stream on public engagement and mobilization, including mobilizing and supporting youth-led conversations. Next slide, please. So in particular, I would like to today talk about the thematic action tracks. And there are 5 action tracks under the workstream 2. And you can see here these topics like inclusive, equitable, safe schools, learning and skills for life, work and sustainable development, teachers, digital learning, and financing. I think this conversation during today's webinar, I have delved into many of these topics, and they're very much relevant all across for the discussions of HESI. But in particular, I would like to share the updates regarding the second action track, which is specifically on education for sustainable development. Next slide, please. So this second action track has 3 core elements that are connected to foundational learning, skills for employment and entrepreneurship, and education for sustainable development. And the expected outputs of each of these action tracks are to come up with a policy discussion paper that will inform the discussions around these topics, especially around the pre-summit and summit in September, an online catalog of good practices, and a set of ideas and concrete recommendations for member states. So in this regard, the work on this action track has begun from February, and now we have 2 member states that are going to co-lead this action track, Japan and Colombia. And there's now a UN support team set up for each of these action tracks. And for action track 2, UNESCO is the anchor agency with ILO, UNFCCC, and other agencies such as UNEP, UNICEF, and others involved. And also, there are about 140 different organizations and networks involved in these consultations, including, of course, HESI. So we would like to really invite you for your interest and engagement in these rounds of consultations that will follow between May to June, leading up to the pre-summit on 29th to 30th of June in Paris. So as the next step, specifically, we will circulate this first draft discussion paper among these partners, including HESI, of course, and actively identify and compile good practice examples and refine further the key recommendations that we would like to share with the member states. So finally, next slide, please. So in this regard, we really look forward to your interest and engagement in this process, especially coming from your unique perspectives and learnings through the pandemic, but also throughout the higher education work. So in case you have any other questions along, especially on this action track 2, please don't hesitate to contact me. And also for the general inquiries of the Transforming Education Summit, you can reach out to the Secretariat, which is now based in UNESCO, through the email provided. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan, for outlining this process. So colleagues and friends, this really takes us to the last segment of this webinar. My name is Ola Göransson. I'm a part of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, who is one of the co-chairs of HESI. So here we'd like to outline a little bit on what's next for HESI. But first, let me say a huge thank you to all participants, the speakers, and of course to our moderator, Geraldine, who expertly waded us through these various aspects on how COVID-19 pandemic has really transformed the higher education sector. As we heard, the challenges and in some cases, opportunities are quite multifaceted. And as was mentioned in the opening by Lotta, this webinar is the first one, a part of a series to really celebrate the fact that HESI was launched 10 years ago at the Rio+20 conference. We have certainly come a long way since then, but challenges do remain. So our next webinar in this series is taking place on 1st of June, and the topic is then how the SDGs can be interwoven into higher education across research, learning, and curriculum. This is another highly relevant topic, and I really personally very much look forward to this one. Then the third one is on 21st of June, and here we are really focusing on the celebratory aspects of our work. There have been many initiatives launched in the past years, and we wish to highlight them and learn from them here. A special focus of this webinar will be on initiatives that are geared to the SDGs that are under review at HEPF this year, namely SDG 5 on gender, SDG 14 on oceans, SDG 15 on biodiversity, SDG 17 on partnerships, and of course SDG 4 on education. The next event is then our annual Global Forum, which will be held on July 6th, this year again, fully virtual. The same day, that's also the same day when member states are reviewing Goal 4 on education. So we hope to garner much attention, not just from the higher education community, but also from governments that are in attendance at HEPF. And then, of course, the big moment that we just heard about is the SDGs Transforming Education Summit in September. So our intention for these webinars and our forum in July is to produce a set of recommendations that could feed into both HEPF and the Education Summit. So your views today are much appreciated and will not be lost. So this really wraps it up, at least for the plans that we have up to September. There will be more coming after that, but this is the plan we have now. And we hope you have enjoyed this meeting today and also hope to see you again at the next webinar in June. And as a reminder, registration is the same to all of these webinars and to the forum. So there's no need to really register again, and information will be shared on participation soonest. So again, thank you to everyone very much and goodbye.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. The panelists were fabulous, and the participants as well. Thanks, Ulla, for all your work too. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you
Thank
for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Bye.